let's get back to Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, at least up against some of the historical Yahoo Finance data, may have just hit a new all-time high here. We're going to continue to track this as we move on throughout the rest of the day. Some investors looking ahead to the presidential elections, wondering if it'll be a tailwind or a headwind for the cryptocurrencies. We were joined by Anthony Scaramucci, SkyBridge founder and managing partner, who offered his opinion on the matter. Take a listen.
Specifically for Bitcoin, I think macro, yes, because whether you like Mr. Biden or dislike him, he's for the rule of law and he's for the democratic processes of the United States.
Let's bring in Ben McMillan, who is the IDX Advisors Chief Investment Officer, to discuss more here. Ben, great to have you here with us. You heard there from Scaramucci, who he believes is better for crypto. Who do you believe of the candidates is better for crypto, especially as we kind of stare down November after today?
Yeah, I think at the presidential level, honestly, it's going to matter a lot less than kind of the Super Tuesday primaries that we're seeing, play out at the state level. That's where crypto policy has really been, kind of the forefront of the battlefield. That said, I think it's, depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. I think generally the crypto community probably sees a Trump administration being a little bit more laissez-faire. Not necessarily, targeting crypto like, a lot of Democrats did in Congress. But on the flip side of that, you've got Biden with, the infrastructure bill, which put a lot of liquidity in the system, to the extent that, a Biden regime, continues to ramp up spending, that could obviously be favorable too. But I think if you ask, if you survey most of the crypto industry, they'll probably say that, a Trump administration would be a little bit more laissez-faire and, allow crypto to, flourish a little bit more easily.
Ben, I'm curious what you make of the crypto excitement that we're seeing play out right now. You have Bitcoin just below 69,000. Is it different than what we've seen in past run-ups in Bitcoin? And if so, why?
Yeah, it is different for the very simple reason that now we've got ETFs. So this has been a long time coming, and this is something that groups like us have been talking about for a couple of years now. Is once you've got once you have the approval of these spot Bitcoin ETFs, now all of a sudden it becomes, normal for a lot of investors out there, a lot of advisors. We're going to start seeing Bitcoin allocations pop up in all sorts of, financial advisors model portfolios, as they make plans. Now, all of a sudden, Bitcoin is an easy asset class for them to, to put into these portfolios. We'll start seeing it pop up in 401k plans. And so this is important because this onboards a whole swath of an audience that otherwise, probably never would have really touched crypto. If you go back to kind of the midterms a couple of years ago, it was still largely the domain of, Coinbase, buyers and sellers on Coinbase. It was difficult to hold it in something like an IRA or a 401k plan. And, now this is part of the mainstreaming of crypto. So yeah, this time is different. Now, that said, we can't just, throw caution to the winds as it relates to, the macro regime. I think a big part of the rally continuing is going to be a function like any other risk asset, like tech stocks, for example, is going to be a function of to what degree, the Fed can engineer a quote unquote soft landing. It's looking increasingly favorable, but there are some clouds on the horizon that, plenty of others have talked about as it relates to, things like the coming real estate, debt refinancing that could be a catalyst for a credit event, et cetera. So there's kind of two things there, like I said, Bitcoin, the approval of Bitcoin ETFs is a structural tailwind that I think we're going to see the benefits of for years, but that doesn't mean it's not going to continue to be a volatile ride. And I think in the near term, it's what does the macro picture look like?
We're likely going to see a new all-time high here today for Bitcoin specifically. What is the significance of this all-time high versus what we saw in November of 2021?
Yeah, I think this time you've got more breadth behind it. I think also when back to when you look at the political landscape in general, I think politicians were a lot more anti-crypto a couple of years ago. The kind of the prevailing narrative was it's only used for money laundering and illicit transactions. That's been proven to be not only categorically false, but I think more importantly, you started to see more and more politicians come out, and this is in part a function of the robust lobbying effort on the crypto community, but more politicians recognize that now this is potentially a source of jobs. This is a source of innovation, which frankly, America at this point in our growth cycle, can't, turn our backs on. And so, that coupled with, like I said, kind of this broader, landscape of buyers coming into the market from off the sidelines through these ETFs, this is a lot stronger tailwind, I think, than we saw a couple of years ago at all-time highs, last time around.
Ben, looking ahead to just next month when we're expected to have the Bitcoin halving, how big of a catalyst do you see that being in the near term?
Yeah, so the halving has gotten a lot of attention historically, and it has mattered a lot historically. But remember, at this point, roughly 95% of all Bitcoins that are ever going to be mined are already in the ecosystem. So the halvings matter less as time goes on. Now, that's not to say it's not going to have, no impact. It's certainly going to have an impact, particularly for the mining community. It is going to, restrict supply that's coming online, or the rate of supply that's coming online. So that, just back to economics 101 is again going to provide a nice tailwind for further upside price movement. But again, we're talking about kind of the next 5% of Bitcoin coming on the market. So I think investors psychologically are used to price action being positive kind of going into the halving and then for several months afterwards. This time around, we also have the additional catalyst of the Bitcoin ETFs, which is huge. So I expect the halving to be kind of, moderately accretive, but not nearly as important as it has been historically.
Ben, just lastly, while we have you here, we're staring down a record year for elections internationally here, with 60 plus countries headed to the ballot boxes for vote. For cryptocurrency, are there specific regions where you believe that the digital currency adoption is on the ballot, and Bitcoin, or some of the largest coins out there, are certainly going to have a key time to watch here, or perhaps see the most adoption rate thereafter some of those elections? And which regions would you be watching most notably?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting as it relates to global elections is, El Salvador is a perfect example. Here's a small, emerging economy that just decided to kind of throw in their lot with Bitcoin as a simple kind of set it and forget it de facto currency. And, price appreciation aside, I think that's kind of a compelling model that I would fully expect to see more countries adopt. I could see African countries starting to adopt that model, others Latin American economies start to adopt that model. The other thing as it relates to global elections is, again, let's look at Latin America. Historically, Venezuela, going all the way back to the very inception of Bitcoin, Venezuelans were big buyers of Bitcoin for obvious reasons. They had to protect against capital controls and hyperinflation of their home currency. To the extent that we start to see, inflation or hyperinflation kind of rear its head in other economies, I think you could start to see politicians, similar to what we've seen in Argentina, that are just, going in and kind of whacking deficits across the board and ramping up an adoption of Bitcoin. I mean, I absolutely think we're going to start to see global central banks buying Bitcoin, in the next 5 years. As it relates to which regions to keep an eye on, like I said, I think Africa could be a big adopter of kind of Bitcoin as a de facto kind of central bank. I think in Latin America, you could start to see continuing buying of Bitcoin from capital controls and fleeing currency debasement perspective. And then, of course, we can't ignore China. I think CBDCs is the last place to keep an eye on, even here abroad, even here domestically. But, China has been kind of a prime example of, a government launching a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, with the explicit goal of controlling their population. So there's pros and there's cons. A lot of people are very concerned about CBDCs as it relates to the privacy perspectives. I think those are, important concerns and considerations. And I think that's the third piece of kind of across the globe to keep an eye out is, countries adopting Bitcoin as kind of de facto, currency, citizens using Bitcoin to flee their home currencies, and then countries pushing CBDCs, as a mechanism of digital currency and potentially control.